State Library and have in the past as well. And I'm also a former Wyoming resident. Worked on the Wyoming Quality Network, the Educational Network, and was on the Governor's Telecom, and did a lot of other stuff. I live in Idaho now, and still do some work with Brian and Company. What we're going to talk about here, this is kind of a relevant topic for us because a couple months ago, I should say, we were pretty heavily involved in debugging, helping to debug workflows performance issue at a county library. And a lot of what we're going to talk about comes right out of that talk, how we did it, and given that we were working with some county folks that were new to debugging, it helped us scale the level at which this talk should be given. So by necessity, there's a certain amount of technical complexity in this discussion, but I've been maintaining in 2 other sessions previous to this one that we can avoid the geek speak and get somewhere in plain English. So there's some basic tenets. I don't expect you to walk away with everything totally comprehensible out of this talk, but there's some main premises that we're going to talk about that revolve around why workflows performance changes in the first place. And most of this discussion is going to revolve around the discussion of what we're going to call latency in a network. And by latency, we mean the time or the delay it takes an IP packet to go from your workflow client to the Testi server in China. And as you'll find out presently, latency is what I like to call a multi-component beast. It's complicated. There's many different sources and types of latency along that path between your client and the Testi workstation. We're going to look at each and every one of those, and then we're going to talk about, that'll give you the basis to understand why performance can degrade. Remember, I'm talking about degrading short of somebody in a backhoe cutting the wire in your building. Your performance would certainly degrade in that scenario, but under normal operation and normal load on your networks, your provider networks, and the public internet in general, the behavior of your application normally changes because load, you probably intuitively know on the internet, there are times of the day when things slow up, and times of the day they get better, and that's merely a function of how many people are doing how many things at any given time. It's just a number of packets that are on this thing we call the internet.
So about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody? Is it around that time?
Yeah, and you'll know, you can definitely see it. And there's a reason for that, and that's normal behavior. But the ramifications of that behavior on your end is that your response time, and by response time I mean how long it takes you to perform a task via workflows, changes. And you definitely feel that, and it is a normal function of load. So we're going to talk about why that occurs, where it occurs, and if you see that that's happening, some things you can do to try to identify what's going on, short of calling your provider, and then ultimately when you call your provider, what you say to them. So don't attempt to jump out the window if it seems like we're getting a little bit too complex. I'll bring you back to earth. And a lot of this is, I think you'll find out, is a lot of it's just common sense. All right, let's jump right into this. These are the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about your internet provision, the provider and the services, and how you interact with those folks. Some common network configurations at your libraries relating to your provider. We're going to talk about the workflows application itself and some basic troubleshooting methods, and then I'm going to give you a recommendation of some things I think you should be doing every day that will simplify your life in general and certainly be of benefit if you get into troubleshooting territory. Now, I'm assuming everybody in this room is a workflows client and at one time or another has experienced issues with your workflows application and or your internet provision in general. Okay, because this is important. We're focusing on the workflows application, but everything we talk about that doesn't specifically reference workflows is still true for anything you do via the internet. So these same tenets hold true for when you're browsing, surfing, or whatever, or using any other application for that matter that uses the internet. Same deal, different application. So let's jump right in and get wet, so to speak. Here's some of the things in the internet provision world that the internet provider does for you. Usually they supply, and by internet provider I mean the people who you pay the monthly check to access the internet. RT, Wyoming.com, ACT, Quest. And keep in mind that there are big providers and what we call mom and pop providers, and they operate in two separate worlds. And how you interact with them and what they can do for you is totally different. And we're going to cover that. But usually they put a piece of demarcation equipment on your site. And it's called demarcation equipment because that's the point of demarcation between what you're responsible for and what they're responsible for. Typically, they supply you with IP address. They supply you with routing logic that allows your IP packet to come and go from the internet. They may supply you security via a firewall or maybe a router that has some protections on it. They usually provide domain name services. Does everybody know what that is? The internet works on numeric addresses, and human beings have a hard time dealing with those, and they're error prone. There's usually a name. Microsoft.com is a mnemonic name that stands for a numeric address, and a DNS server or service is the intelligence that takes the name and resolves it to the real address that the internet works on. And they may be doing some VLANing for you, which is a way to physically segment your networks for security or traffic performance. Probably they're your email provider. Probably they provide virus, spyware, or spam protection on those emails. Again, they either access the internet or public internet directly, or as in the old days of the library connection, you folks by and large used to connect to the state network. Do you remember those days? That was still a provider connecting you. It's just that the state network was buying their network piece from a provider. That's gone by the wayside, and now you connect what we're going to start calling the public internet cloud. And rather than directly talking to the state leased network, you talk to your provider, who then accesses what we're going to call the public net. If you're lucky enough and you're dealing with a big enough provider, you may even have a service level agreement, which is a contractual guarantee of performance on what you're paying for. It's going to operate a certain way. It's going to be available a certain amount of time. Usually the big carriers do that. The advantage of that is if something goes wrong with your service, they usually have service credits available where if you're down for 2 days, that's 2 days that come off your bill. In the smaller venues of the mom and pops, as we call the smaller providers that came out of the telephony world, local telephone companies, they're usually not big enough to do that. They like the idea, but they usually can't do that, and furthermore, they're not generally regulated by the federal government, so they operate in kind of a loosely coupled world. And hopefully, when things don't work well on your network, and since you're paying these folks, they're monitoring your network and they're going to help you fix it. And I'm going to make this point several times. You're paying them. You're writing them a check. That's part of their service, so don't be shy. Don't be a shrieking violet, so to speak. When things go wrong, you holler. Let them know you're unhappy. Let them know that they need to fix that because their revenue, their business depends on it. So don't be shy when you deal with them. All right. Let's talk a little bit more about this in detail. The demarcation equipment is probably a switch, a router, a modem, some other combination of those devices, maybe doing some security as well. How many people in here are DSL customers? Is anybody still a T1 or fractional T1 customer? Anybody satellite customer? Dial-up? Okay. These are, the services there are traditional legacy wide area networking services that your service is based on. And DSL, without going into the details, the whole talk unto itself, is really a technology that allows the regular old telephone line to be used for both voice, telephony, and data at varying rates, higher speed rates than you typically get in a dial-up modem. But usually your service uses this gear that they own and one of these legacy technologies, and it provides some sort of connection to the public internet. Now, I want you to think of the public internet, as we often say, as a big cloud, right? Who knows what's in there? There's really no single administrative group. There's no single management group. As you all know, it's global now. There's just a lot of stuff in there. It turns out the stuff that's in there has direct relation on how your performance and workflows behaves. But usually your internet provision offers, the way